Can you give us an example of how people are resisting gendered oppression?
Yes, I can. So I think one of the problems with mainstream feminism is that it doesn't understand the different ways in which gender can become a political device, and sexual violence is kind of fundamental to that racial capitalist divide and rule. So one of the things that mainstream feminism does is tries to use the right hand of racial capitalist patriarchy against the left and feeds that cycle of violence. So if sexual violence is a pivot for these intersecting systems of heteropatriarchy and colonial racial capitalism, that means that the acts and threats of sexual violence that keep us afraid, that make us kind of docile subjects of capitalism, also, if we're not careful, drive us into the arms of the carceral colonial state and enable all these other forms of violence, which also act in the service of capitalist accumulation. So by pulling the levers of carceral systems, white feminism participates in what I call the racial capitalist protection racket, which doesn't tackle violence and treats more marginalized groups as disposable. So what I'm going to do is give you an example of politics that doesn't do that. You've probably heard about the murder of Sarah Everard in the UK. Sarah Everard was murdered by a serving police officer in London in March 2021. The previous June, members of the same police force, the London Met, were suspended for taking selfies with the bodies of two sisters who were murdered, Nicole Smallman and Biba Henry, in a different London park. And what mainstream feminism did after this murder was ask for more carceral stuff, calling for street harassment to be criminalized and for misogyny to become a hate crime. So a woman is murdered by a serving police officer. Mainstream white feminism says more power to the police. And thank goodness for Sisters Uncut, who did not do this, who instead said police are the perpetrators and launched the Kill the Bill campaign. The Kill the Bill campaign opposes the expanded policing powers in the Policing, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill, which is currently in Parliament. It asks the public to withdraw their consent from British policing. So what they're doing there is really seeing that racial capitalist protection racket and saying, we do not consent to this. We're not going to be part of this. Police are the perpetrators. Male violence is police violence, is state violence. You know, it's all part of the same thing. So they demand that police budgets are cut, and instead we put that funding into support services for domestic and sexual abuse services. They've also launched police intervention training. So what to do if you see somebody being brutalized by the police. And the plan is for national cop watch groups to be created. And the slogan for this is become ungovernable. So it really is about withdrawing consent from that bargain, you know, which is kind of like the patriarchal bargain that women strike, you know, where we give up our freedom for the protection of individual men who are actually more likely to abuse us than the men they're telling us to be afraid of. It's the same kind of protection racket, but it's writ large. So Sisters Uncut's work is grounded in abolition feminism, which I'm sure you'll talk about in this module if you haven't already. Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Miners and Beth Ritchie's recent book, Abolition Feminism Now, is a really good introduction. And they define abolition feminism as feminism that is actually focused on ending gender violence in all its forms. So this means ending sexual violence, means ending state violence, especially the violence of policing and criminal punishment, the violence of borders as well. So it's an expansive concept of violence. It's interpersonal, community, state violence, the violence of war, occupation, violence against the planet. It's seeing it all as part of the same thing, part of the same sort of dynamic. And it's concerned with all kinds of harm, not trying to end one harm by perpetrating another, which is what mainstream white feminism tends to do. And there's lots of organizations and interventions operating under this framework. So there's a website called Transform Harm, which is created by Mariam Kaba, who is a really key figure in abolition feminism. That's a really good resource. It's got loads of links that you can follow to kind of learn about different ideas and projects. Insight, Critical Resistance, and Survived and Punished in the US as well. Sisters Uncut in the UK, Abolitionist Futures, Read and Resist. Alternative Justice in India is also a really good project. And then in Australia, there's a couple of projects that I wanted to mention. So Flat Out and Sisters Inside, which are both to do with incarcerated people, incarcerated women. Sisters Inside especially is focused on. And in light of what I think has been an increase in the incarceration of Indigenous women in Australia as well, who are obviously more likely to be seen as criminals than victims for some of the reasons that we've talked about today. So Sisters Inside is a case study in the Angela Davis book. And they do service work for people who are incarcerated, all recently released. They also do legal work as well. So they want people out of prison, and they also want services that allow them to stay out of prison, because many of the reasons why people are in prison is because of things that they don't have access to in the free world. So it's kind of working across prison walls as well, which is really, really inspiring. So I just wanted to mention that because I thought that would be quite relevant for your students.
Absolutely. And it also links to our discussion in a few weeks' time with Tabitha Lean, who's a formerly incarcerated Indigenous woman who is also an abolitionist activist and who works closely with Sisters Inside. So it's perfect. It really, there's a lot of links that you've, knowingly or unknowingly managed to draw over the, the entire semester. And I think it's going to be extremely useful for our students. So yes, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. That was fun.